I met Selma, I just met, before I met C.L.R. James, because Selma used to do transcribed interviews, filmed interviews. And what was delightful about sending to Selma for transcribing is that she just didn't transcribe them. She gave you in the margin her comments about their thoughts, saying, don't use this, rubbish, can't disagree more. And so the pre-edit of my transcript was first made by Selma. And so we began a conversation, a meeting entirely over the phone, and then met later when I met C.L.R. Selma can't remember that, but I remember it vividly. Anyway, the film. It wasn't easy to make the film. I first came across the book at the end of in about 1970, I think. And of course I thought it was extraordinary. And I'd been trying to do films about sport because I was interested in the relationship between sport and art. And had been trying to get the BBC to agree to this. And then I read Beyond a Boundary, and I thought it was the most beautifully written, extraordinary book about sport I'd ever read. And but nobody at the BBC would go for it until in 1975, a friend of mine called Barry Gavin became the editor of BBC One's cultural main arts programme, Omnibus. And Barry said, as soon as he got the editor, he said, Mike, you know that film you've always wanted to make with C.L.R. James? Make it. So that was terrific. So I thought, well, there we are. We're going to make it. So I then went off to research the film in Trinidad, only to be met at the airport by someone who was a representative of Trinidad and Tobago Television, saying, sorry that C.L.R. James is persona non grata, would you mind returning to England? Because we are not, we don't want the BBC to intervene in Trinidadian politics, and we have an election coming up. And I said, I think that's absolutely outrageous. When is the election? And they said, well, we don't know. I said, well, how could you possibly accuse the BBC, incarnated by me, in trying to intervene in the Trinidadian election, which you don't know it even exists? And anyway, I sat there by the swimming pool I was in a sort of somewhere between a Graham Greene novel and a V.S. Naipaul novel, by this swimming pool at the Queen's Park Hotel, waiting for the phone to ring. And anyway, cut a long shot, there was various sort of interviews and conversations, but then I had to come back to England. Then there were all sorts of negotiations with the Trinidadian ambassador. And then it transpired, of course, that everybody was speaking on behalf of Eric Williams, and nobody had actually asked Eric Williams himself. And although, of course, the tragedy was with C.L.R. James, is that actually Eric Williams, who had been his pupil, for whom he'd outlined the thesis of the book that became Capitalism and Slavery, was something that C.L.R. James had proposed to Eric Williams. When Eric Williams took to power, the political program fell apart, and of course when Eric Williams heard, I think, that actually that somebody had been trying to attempt to stop the BBC making a film based on Beyond the Boundary, he was outraged and said, that's ridiculous. The one thing he didn't want to do, he recognized, of course, the power of C.L.R. James, the importance of the book, that he was one of the great Caribbean writers and intellectuals, and such a thing was possible. C.L.R. James was forced to write a little piece saying that he wouldn't, whilst we were filming, get involved in any political meetings whilst during his stay in Trinidad, which was something which I didn't want him to have to write, but he said that. So it was not an easy genesis, the film, but it was a wonderful thing for me to do, and I feel hugely privileged to have met and worked with C.L.R. James, who's quite one of the most remarkable men I've ever been with in my life, and so wide-ranging that the last conversation I had with him, which was just a few weeks before he died, was about Don Giovanni, because I was making a film about Don Juan, and of course he had so many thoughts to make about Mozart's Don Giovanni. And I will just give one small Jacobin story, my favorite black Jacobin story. I was in New York, and I got a taxi to go out to Kennedy Airport, and it was a Haitian driver. And I started talking to him about his history and how he'd come to New York and driving a taxi in New York and what's the history of his relationship to Haiti and why he had to leave. And he talked, and he said, I'll tell you how I keep sane. And he opened his glove box and he brought out the most battered copy I've ever seen of Black Jacobins. And he says, whenever I get depressed about myself, I read this book. And I've read it so many times. And of course, when I said that I happened to know him, you know, that he was absolutely thrilled. And we had the most wonderful conversation all the way out to Kennedy Airport. It's the only time when I was grateful that there was traffic jams, because the conversation went on and on. But it also tells you something, I think, about the way that influence happens. You know, I think when one's making films or writing books, you're, in a funny way, you're like a bottle. You know, they think you'll throw bottles into the sea, and you don't quite know where the bottle is going to wash up. And I think the thing is that C.L.R. James is like that. You know, he's hugely important. And I think probably don't really know the half of the influence his books have had on individuals and people, inspiring them, creating the context of their sense of themselves and their sense of the possibility of their lives offer. So I just want to thank you for coming here to watch this film. It isn't quite the finished film, but I can't go back to the original, and this is a version. Anyway, it's the only version there is, and it's what it is. And it starts off, of course, with a long quotation from William Hazlitt, who was C.L.R. James's favourite writer, one of his favourite writers, and it is from the first great essay about sport ever written, which is from William Hazlitt's essay on the Indian jugglers.